The Texas sun was merciless that Tuesday afternoon. Heat rippled across Highway 45, turning the asphalt into a wavering mirage. Dust devils spun across the empty fields on either side, and the occasional buzzard circled lazily overhead. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, silence was the law of the land. Silence, until flashing red and blue lights cut through the glare of Rachel Monroe's rearview mirror. Her heart gave a dull thud. Not fear, instinct. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't weaving. She wasn't even close to breaking a traffic law. She glanced at her speedometer, 43 in a 45 zone, clean as could be, and yet the patrol car behind her clung to her bumper like a predator circling prey. Rachel sighed, hands steady on the wheel as she guided her silver sedan onto the gravel shoulder. She had driven this stretch a dozen times before, usually without incident, but today felt different. A chill threaded down her spine despite the heat pressing against the glass. For 72 hours, she hadn't been Director Monroe, head of a federal agency. She'd been Aunt Rachel, laughing with her sister's kids in San Antonio, making pancakes, losing at video games, braiding hair with clumsy fingers. She had slipped out of her armor, just for a weekend, but as she rolled down the window, the armor slid back on, invisible but unbreakable. The patrol car doors opened in unison. Two figures emerged. The older one, square jaw, thinning blonde hair tucked under a sweat-stained cap, walked with the heavy confidence of a man who believed the badge made him untouchable. Sergeant Blake Miller, his younger partner, lean, restless, eyes darting like a wolf pup, eager to impress, hung back by Rachel's trunk. Deputy Tyler Crow. The formation made Rachel's stomach tighten. It was a textbook pincer move. You didn't waste manpower covering blind spots on routine traffic stops. This was intimidation, predatory, deliberate. "Afternoon, ma'am," Miller drawled, leaning down toward her half-open window. His breath smelled of stale coffee. His eyes, sharp and invasive, crawled across her face and hands, cataloging her every twitch. "License and registration. You drifted over the line back there." Rachel met his gaze evenly. "I don't believe I did, officer, but here are my documents." She moved slowly, deliberately, retrieving her wallet from the center console and her registration from the glove compartment. Every gesture was deliberate, calm hands, no sudden movement. He took the license, holding it longer than necessary, his lips curved around her name. "Monroe." A pause, a near-invisible nod to his partner. Rachel felt the temperature in the air change. Her instincts were screaming. She'd faced cartel leaders across polished tables in Mexico, interrogated smugglers who thought murder was easier than truth. The air right now was the same, thick with danger. Miller tucked the license into his vest pocket. "Pop the trunk." Rachel's pulse ticked faster, though her face betrayed nothing. "Is that a request or a lawful order based on probable cause?" Crow shifted behind her, one hand brushing the baton at his hip. His voice was mocking, tinged with false sweetness. "What, you got something to hide in there?" "Ma'am?" She could see the setup, as clearly as if it were written on a boardroom chalk line. Pressure, escalation, a planted excuse. They were pushing her to break, to snap, to argue, to give them the crack they needed to force the door wide open. But Rachel Monroe hadn't risen through the ranks of federal law enforcement by losing her composure. "I know exactly what's in my trunk," she said firmly, her tone calm but edged with steel. "And I know my rights." Miller's eyes narrowed. "We don't need to argue. You comply now, or we do this the hard way." The threat hung in the scorching air. Dust blew across the shoulder, whispering against her tires. Rachel weighed her options. Refuse, and they'd drag her out by force. Consent, and they'd plant whatever they came to plant. Neither was safe, but sometimes survival meant playing along just long enough to turn the tables. She pressed the trunk release. The faint click echoed like a gunshot. Crow disappeared from view. Rachel's fingers curled tightly against her thighs. She thought of her sister's kids, those soft moments of laughter and sticky maple syrup smiles. She thought of the weight of the badge in her own world. She thought of how quickly predators revealed themselves when they thought they had a cornered victim. Seconds later, Crow reemerged, a grin spreading across his face. Dangling from his fingers was a clear plastic bag filled with white powder. His smirk was venomous. Well, 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 look what we got here. Rachel locked eyes with him in the rearview mirror. Her voice, low and steady, cut through the heat. That is not mine. You sure about that? Crow sneered. I am absolutely certain. Miller leaned closer, his face nearly filling her window. You're a long way from Washington, ma'am. Out here, things can get real uncomfortable for people who like to argue. Rachel's gaze didn't waver. I know my rights. I do not consent to this search, and I am requesting legal representation immediately. You are presenting an item that was not in my vehicle. Crow snorted, laughing. Hear that, Miller? We got ourselves a law professor. Miller's lips curled into something darker than amusement. He crouched lower, his eyes two chips of ice. That tone of he murmured. You think you're someone special? Out here, the badge means you follow orders. Rachel's reply was almost a whisper, but it landed like thunder. Then I suggest you follow the law yourself. Call your supervisor, now. For a split second, fury flashed across his face. Pure, unmasked rage. The audacity of this woman, challenging him on his stretch of road. His hand shot to her door handle. The metal screeched as he yanked it open, searing desert heat rushing in. His grip clamped around her arm, crushing her skin, yanking her out into the open. Crow moved instantly, practiced and precise. Together they shoved her against her sedan, the sun-baked metal scorching through her shirt. The handcuffs bit into her wrists, ratcheted too tight on purpose. Not so tough now, are you? Crow hissed in her ear. Rachel lifted her chin, her back straight despite the pain. Her voice carried across the empty highway, clear enough for the passing cars to hear if anyone slowed. This is illegal. I have offered no resistance. That powder was not in my trunk. I demand your badge numbers. They ignored her. The cruiser's back door opened with a slam. She was shoved inside, glass smeared with grime blurring her view. From the road, drivers saw what they were supposed to see, a routine arrest, a neat little performance. But Rachel Monroe knew different. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't a random stop. This was an ambush. What Miller and Crow didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that their chosen victim wasn't just any woman driving home from family. She was the one person on that highway who had the power to unravel everything they'd built. And the second they snapped those handcuffs around her wrists, their lives as free men were already over. The cruiser's back seat smelled like sweat, vinyl, and the faint copper tang of old blood. Rachel Monroe sat with her wrists pinched raw by steel cuffs, her reflection faint in the scratched divider glass. Outside, endless miles of scrubland blurred by until the patrol car finally slowed. They turned off the highway into a gravel lot, where a squat, concrete police station squatted like an afterthought against the desert. Paint peeled from the walls, windows covered in dust so thick they barely reflected the sun. A faded American flag hung limp on a bent pole. Miller dragged her out first, his grip iron on her elbow. Crow followed, swagger in his step, swinging the bag of evidence like a trophy. A couple of townsfolk paused across the street, one woman in an apron, holding a grocery sack, squinted before quickly turning away. Nobody interfered. Inside, the air was stale with burnt coffee and industrial cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly pallor. Behind a cluttered booking desk sat a sergeant with drooping jowls and eyes half-lidded with boredom. His nameplate read, Sergeant Wilkins. He barely looked up as Miller shoved Rachel toward the counter. Possession, obstruction, Miller grunted. tossing the bag of powder onto the desk like a hunter dropping meat. Wilkins sighed, reached for a form, and began scratching notes with a chewed pen. Name? Miller shoved Rachel forward. Tell him. Her voice was steady, almost quiet. Rachel Monroe. Wilkins began typing on the battered terminal in front of him. His fingers moved lazily across the keys. Monroerachel. The letters blinked on the monitor. Then something happened. The system stuttered, froze for half a beat, and then flagged red. Lines of text flooded the screen. Director, Drug Enforcement Administration. Classification, Level 5. Immediate federal contact required. Wilkins' posture changed instantly. The pen clattered to the desk. His hands trembled slightly as his eyes darted between the screen and Rachel's face. Ma'am. His voice cracked. He licked his lips, pale as chalk. We didn't know. Rachel straightened, the cuffs biting into her wrists. For the first time since the stop, the room shifted in her favor. She leaned across the counter, her presence expanding to fill the dingy space. Put the phone down, she commanded as Wilkins' hand darted toward the receiver. Her tone was soft but carried the weight of command honed over decades. Secure this building. Freeze your internal network access. Every squad car log, every surveillance feed, every booking record is now federal evidence. Wilkins froze, eyes wide. Yes, ma'am. Miller's smirk faltered. What the hell is this? Rachel turned her head slowly, pinning him with eyes sharp as glass. This is the end of your career, Sergeant Miller, and the beginning of your indictment. Crow shifted uneasily, his earlier bravado draining from his face. She's bluffing. She's just... Before he could finish, the sound of engines roared outside. Black SUVs with federal plates screeched into the lot. Tires spitting gravel. Men and women in tactical gear poured out. Weapons slung but ready. The unmistakable authority of federal agents radiating from their every step. The air in the station thickened. Rachel extended her hands. Remove these cuffs. Wilkins scrambled to obey, fumbling with the keys until the cuffs clattered to the floor. Rachel rubbed her raw wrist briefly, then turned toward Miller and Crow. You have 5 seconds to stand down. But in that heartbeat of hesitation, the two officers bolted. They shoved past a rookie standing by the hallway, barreled through a side door, and vanished into the blinding Texas sun. By the time the DEA tactical team surged inside, weapons ready, Miller and Crow were gone, rats slipping through a crack in the wall. Director Monroe, one of her agents, snapped to attention, handing her a radio headset. Orders? Rachel's voice was ice. Lock this station down. No one leaves. No files get touched. Seal every terminal, every logbook. I want every patrol route cross-checked with missing evidence reports. We're not just dealing with dirty cops. We're dealing with a system. Her agents fanned out like a tide overtaking a beach. Doors slammed shut. Phones were disconnected. Servers unplugged and sealed. The building transformed from a sleepy desert station into the epicenter of a federal operation in less than 5 minutes. Rachel stood in the middle of the chaos, calm, resolute. She knew the stakes had just shifted. Miller and Crow weren't freelancers. They were part of something larger. The planted drugs weren't random. They carried markings, invisible to most, but clear to her trained eye. A tiny numeric code stamped near the seal of the bag. Her stomach turned. She recognized it. That bag wasn't street-level dope. It was evidence, federal evidence, from a cartel bust 6 months ago in Houston. The drugs were supposed to be locked away in a DEA warehouse 1,000 miles from here. She turned to her team. Confirm the serials. If I'm right, this bag didn't just fall out of the sky. Someone's bleeding our evidence back onto the street. Within the hour, confirmation came. The powder matched perfectly to a sealed evidence lot that had been logged, tested, and destroyed, at least on paper. The implications were staggering. These two small-town cops hadn't just tried to frame a random woman. They had been running stolen government narcotics through their own traffic stop pipeline, and if they had the nerve to plant it on her, they had probably planted it on countless others. Rachel closed her eyes for half a second, pulling in a slow breath. She pictured Miller's smirk, Crow's cruel laugh. She pictured the long, silent line of drivers who had probably sat in that same dusty lot, cuffed, confused, powerless, their lives unraveling because two predators decided they were convenient targets. When she opened her eyes again, her voice was steel. "We find them, and when we do, we pull the whole rotten tree up by its roots." The hunt had begun. Night fell heavy over the desert, pressing shadows against the squat walls of the county station. Federal agents had turned the place inside out, sealing boxes, pulling hard drives, photographing every scrap of paper. The fluorescent buzz was constant, mixing with the clatter of keyboards and the low murmur of agents cross-checking data. Rachel Monroe sat in a dim office, the glow of a monitor illuminating her face. Her wrists still bore faint bruises from the cuffs, but her eyes were sharp, unyielding. She scrolled through files that had been marked corrupted, incomplete, or simply lost. She knew the pattern. Evidence doesn't vanish by accident. Her agents worked silently around her, but Rachel's mind tunneled deep into the digital graveyard. Case after case, she noticed the same markers. Minority drivers pulled over on empty roads, narcotics discovered, footage from body cameras conveniently unavailable. Some files contained only a page or two, bland summaries with the same vague wording. Then she stopped. A name blinked from the screen. Marcus Lee, age 22. Deceased. Custody incident. Rachel clicked it open. The report was barely a paragraph. Subject exhibited erratic behavior. Became violent in holding cell. Death by self-inflicted injury. Her jaw tightened. She'd read too many of these tidy lies in her career. She scrolled deeper, fingers impatient, eyes sharp. Hidden among mislabeled folders, she found it. A single video file. Low resolution. Almost invisible. Someone had tried to bury it, but not well enough. She opened it. The footage was grainy, shot on a shaky cell phone. The angle was crooked, filmed through a narrow slit of a holding cell door. The audio crackled, but the images were clear enough. Marcus Lee, thin, bright-eyed, his face smooth with youth, sat in the corner of the cell, hands cuffed, pleading. "Please," his voice shook, desperate. "I didn't do anything. Please, just call my mom. Just let me." The door slammed open. Two uniforms entered. Rachel didn't need the video to tell her who they were. Blake Miller's broad frame filled the doorway. Tyler Crow a step behind, smirk already plastered on his face. The recording shook as the bystander, whoever had the courage to film, flinched. But the camera stayed. Miller grabbed Marcus first, yanking him up by the collar. Crow swung his baton down hard. Marcus's cry echoed in the tinny speaker, sharp enough to make Rachel's throat tighten. Blow after blow landed. Marcus begged, voice weakening, words spilling out between gasps. "Please, I'm not. Please stop." Then silence. His body slumped, motionless. Miller dropped him like discarded trash. Crow muttered something, but the audio garbled. They left the cell, door slamming shut. The camera jolted one last time before cutting out. Rachel sat frozen, fists clenched tight on the desk. For a moment she couldn't breathe. Her stomach churned. She'd seen executions in cartel safe houses, killings in foreign prisons. But this was different. This was home soil. This was supposed to be justice. Her agent, Torres, hovered in the doorway, reading the fury in her posture. "Director?" She turned, voice low but steady. "Preserve this file. Triple backup. Lock it under federal chain. This is evidence of homicide." Torres nodded, already calling in tech support. Rachel pushed back from the desk, pacing the cramped office. She imagined Marcus Lee's mother getting the call. Suicide, they told her. Case closed. She pictured her fighting for 2 years, filing lawsuit after lawsuit, stonewalled at every turn, told her son was unstable. And now the truth sat glowing on Rachel's screen. Undeniable. She pressed her palms against the desk, grounding herself. You wanted to be Aunt Rachel, just for one weekend, she thought bitterly. But the universe had other plans. When she finally spoke, her voice carried like a blade. Issue a federal warrant. We're charging Miller and Crow with the murder of Marcus Lee. Torres blinked. Yes, ma'am. But if this file was hidden here, it means someone higher up signed off on the cover-up. This isn't just two dirty cops. Rachel's eyes darkened. I know. That's why we ripped this operation out by the roots. By dawn, the picture was widening. Dozens of cases bore the same marks. Planted drugs, corrupted footage, lives ruined. But the system was too smooth, too coordinated. This wasn't freelance. It was infrastructure. The pieces clicked together like a puzzle Rachel wished she didn't recognize. Evidence stolen from DEA warehouses. Narcotics recirculated onto highways. A steady stream of arrests padding department stats while innocent people's lives were destroyed. And now, with Marcus Lee's death, they had murder tying the threads together. Rachel stood in the briefing room, agents crowded around, maps and files plastered across the walls. This isn't about Miller and Crow anymore, she said, voice carrying. They're soldiers. The real enemy is whoever's pulling their strings. We're dealing with a network, and we're going to burn it down. On the table before her lay the bag Crow had tried to frame her with. She picked it up, holding it like a poisonous artifact. This, she said, isn't just cocaine. Look closer. The room leaned in. Near the seal was the faint numeric code. Rachel tapped it. This matches a Houston bust 6 months ago. Evidence logged, sealed, and supposedly destroyed. But here it is, which means someone with access is bleeding federal seizures back onto the street. Silence followed, thick with realization. Rachel set the bag down with deliberate force. They're not just framing random drivers. They're running an entire shadow operation. And if we don't stop it now, Marcus Lee won't be the last body we find. Her team nodded grimly. The manhunt for Miller and Crow was now a federal priority. Checkpoints went up. Warnings blared across channels. But Rachel's gut told her something else. That 2 county officers didn't have the brains or resources to run a scheme this large. They were pawns, disposable, which meant someone much higher was calling the shots. As she looked again at Marcus Lee's frozen image on the monitor, eyes full of fear, mouth open mid-plea, she made a silent promise. You won't be forgotten, not while I'm breathing. And in that promise, the next phase of the battle began. The desert bled into morning, pale orange light spilling over the low hills. At the federal command post now occupying the county station, the night's findings had piled high. Files, photos, video stills, all pointing to a corruption web so wide it no longer made sense to call it a case. It was a system, a machine. Rachel Monroe leaned over the war table, both palms pressed into a map covered with pins and strings. Every red mark was a false arrest. Every blue tag was evidence that had gone missing from official custody. The lines formed a lattice across 3 counties. Torres, her field agent, slid another folder toward her. Director, we traced the flow of those evidence bags. They don't just vanish from warehouses. They're signed out, rerouted, repackaged, and it's coordinated across at least 5 departments. Rachel flipped open the file. Who has clearance to make that happen? Torres hesitated. Not many. At least, not without someone upstairs smoothing the paperwork. Rachel's gut tightened. She'd been waiting for this confirmation, but hearing it aloud made her throat dry. Someone who knows DEA procedure, someone with high-level access. Torres nodded grimly. And someone who's been off the radar for a while. The room was silent. Everyone knew what that meant. Rachel's voice dropped, steady as stone. Name, Torres exhaled. Jonathan Finch. The name hit the room like a dropped weight. Rachel knew it well. Finch had once worn the same badge she did. A DEA agent with a brilliant career, until everything fell apart. 3 years ago, Finch was reported dead in a fiery car accident outside Dallas, but whispers had never faded. Anomalies in the crash report, unanswered questions about seized assets that disappeared around the same time. And now, his ghost surfaced again. Rachel stared at the name on the file, her jaw hardening. If Finch is alive, then he's the architect. Miller and Crow are pawns in his game. By noon, her team had pieced together what they now knew to be the Sentinel Protocol, a blueprint for corruption disguised as routine policing. Drugs seized from cartel busts were quietly siphoned out, funneled into the hands of officers like Miller and Crow, innocent motorists, usually minorities or travelers unlikely to fight back, were pulled over and framed. The drugs found on them doubled as laundering tools. Arrests that padded stats, powder that could re-enter the black market once evidence disappeared again. The genius of it was its simplicity. Each department involved looked like it was just doing its job. Arrests were logged, paperwork filed. Courtrooms saw the same patterns so often they stopped asking questions. But buried in the heart of it all was Jonathan Finch, pulling strings like a spider in its web. Rachel stood in front of her assembled team. Find him! The search ended faster than anyone expected. Finch wasn't hiding in Mexico or holed up with cartel allies. He was living in plain sight, in a quiet Austin suburb. His house was painted cream, lawn trimmed neatly, a white picket fence out front, a retired couple paradise. The last place anyone would suspect the mastermind of a criminal empire. But surveillance revealed the truth. Curtains never opened, deliveries left at the door vanished within seconds. And inside, according to heat signatures picked up by drones, an entire room blazed hotter than the rest, packed with electronics. Rachel insisted on being there. At dawn, DEA tactical vans rolled silently down Finch's street. Neighbors peered through blinds as agents in black gear flooded out, forming a perimeter. Rachel pulled on a vest, her face set, eyes burning with the memory of Marcus Lee's pleading voice. Torres tapped his headset. Director, we're go. Rachel nodded once. Breach. Aho. The front door splintered under the ram. Agents stormed in, flashlights cutting through the dim. They expected gunfire, resistance, chaos, but instead, they found silence. In the center of the house was a den converted into a digital fortress. Banks of monitors glowed in the darkness, dozens of feeds playing in real time, squad cars, evidence lockers, even courthouse hallways. Finch had been watching everything, controlling his network from the shadows. And there he sat, calm as if expecting company. Jonathan Finch had aged. His once black hair was peppered with gray, his face leaner, sharper. But his eyes, the eyes of a man who believed himself untouchable, still glimmered with arrogance. Well, he said smoothly, as agents surrounded him, rifles trained. I was wondering how long it would take you. Rachel, her jaw clenched. On your feet. He didn't move. Instead, he leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head in mock relaxation. You know, I thought Miller and Crow could handle you. But then again, you were always stubborn. That's why the agency promoted you, wasn't it? Rachel's voice was flat. That's why you failed. Cuff him. Finch smirked as steel snapped around his wrists. Failed, director? You really think cutting off one head ends the Hydra? She stepped closer, her voice quiet enough only he could hear. This isn't mythology. This is federal law. And you're done. Later, back at the command post, Rachel replayed Finch's words in her mind. His arrogance wasn't just performance. It was confidence built on years of getting away with the unthinkable. Miller and Crow were already in custody, captured during a desert raid at an abandoned ranch house where they'd holed up like cornered animals. They had surrendered pale, trembling, knowing their empire was crumbling. But Finch was different. He had planned this network, nurtured it, even in shackles. He radiated the belief that he would walk free. Rachel stood before her team, exhaustion etched on every face but determination burning brighter. "This doesn't end with an arrest," she told them. "This ends when the entire country sees what they did. When every lie is dragged into the light, when every family, like Marcus Lee's, finally hears the truth." Torres spoke softly. "You mean Congress?" Rachel nodded. "Yes, we take this to the top. And we don't stop until there's no place left for corruption to hide." Her voice rang in the silence, hard as iron. The puppet master had been unmasked, but now came the real fight, to tear his entire empire down in front of the nation, piece by bloody piece. The Capitol dome gleamed under morning light, its marble face glowing against a pale blue sky. Inside, the air was charged, journalists elbowing for position, cameras humming, aides whispering in corners. The congressional hearing room had transformed into a stage, and today's performance would dismantle a criminal empire in front of the entire nation. At the center sat Dr. Rachel Monroe. Her dark suit was plain, but her presence commanded the room more powerfully than any uniform. She wasn't here as the victim of a frame job. She was here as the director of the DEA, the woman who had torn open the rot hiding beneath the thin veneer of American justice. Flashes popped as she raised her hand, swore her oath, and took her seat. Across from her, members of Congress shuffled their papers nervously. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a typical oversight meeting. Rachel began simply. Her voice carried not just through the microphones, but through every speaker across the country tuned in live. 3 weeks ago, she said, 2 county officers attempted to frame me for drug possession during a fabricated traffic stop in rural Texas. What they didn't realize was that they were exposing the largest corruption network in law enforcement history. The room stilled. One by one, Rachel laid out the evidence. The stolen evidence bags, complete with federal tracking codes, the corrupted files from county servers, the grainy cell phone footage of Marcus Lee's final minutes. Each revelation landed like a hammer. On the projector behind her, the images flickered. Marcus's young face, his pleas, the brutality of Miller and Crow, and finally the bag of cocaine Crow had dangled at her window. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some lawmakers covered their mouths, others clenched their jaws. Rachel didn't dramatize when she didn't need to. She spoke like a surgeon, each word precise, each cut revealing deeper infection. "This was called the Sentinel Protocol," she said. "Its purpose was simple: recycle seized narcotics back into circulation, frame innocent people to cover the trail, and generate millions in illicit profits." The operation spread across 5 departments, shielded by falsified reports and destroyed footage. For years, no one asked questions. Until now, cameras zoomed in. Viewers at home could see the steel in her eyes, the exhaustion in her posture, the unshakable resolve of a woman who had carried Marcus Lee's voice with her every day since she first watched that hidden video. "And this network," she continued, "was not led by 2 rogue officers. It was designed and orchestrated by a man you once trusted, Jonathan Finch, a former DEA agent who faked his death to build a criminal empire." The screen shifted to Finch's mugshot, shackled, hollow-eyed, his arrogance stripped away. The man who thought himself untouchable was now nothing more than a prisoner. Rachel let the silence linger before finishing. "This isn't just about drugs. It isn't even just about corruption. It's about the lives destroyed. Like Marcus Lee's. His death was called suicide. But we now know the truth. It was murder. And today, in his name, we demand justice." By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the chamber. Applause broke out, scattered at first, then swelling into thunder. The chairman's gavel finally restored order, but the damage was done. The nation had seen the rot, and there was no going back. The courtroom was no less charged when the trials began. Blake Miller and Tyler Crowe sat in shackles, their orange jumpsuits stripping them of the swagger they once wore like armor. They avoided Rachel's gaze as the judge read the charges: murder, conspiracy, evidence tampering, racketeering. Each word landed heavier than the last. The jury deliberated less than a day. "Guilty," the foreman said, voice steady. The judge's gavel came down like a thunderclap. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the murder of Marcus Lee. Additional sentences to be served consecutively for conspiracy and corruption. Miller's shoulders sagged. Crowe's face went pale. For the first time, the predators looked like prey. And then came Finch. He entered the federal courtroom flanked by marshals, his gray hair combed neatly, his eyes still carrying the glint of superiority. But arrogance doesn't sway juries the way evidence does. And Rachel had given them plenty. Every stolen bag, every falsified report, every name of every family torn apart by his protocol. When the verdict came, Finch's composure finally cracked. Guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in a supermax facility, his empire reduced to dust. The man who once believed himself a puppet master would spend his remaining years in a concrete box. No strings left to pull. But Rachel knew real justice couldn't end with convictions. It had to be rebuilt. Standing again before Congress weeks later, she unveiled the reforms born from the ashes of Sentinel. It would be called the Lee Initiative, named for Marcus Lee, the young man whose stolen life had exposed everything. Under the initiative, every police body camera would be fitted with tamper-proof encryption, evidence handling would follow transparent, civilian-audited chains of custody, independent oversight boards would carry the power to investigate misconduct, armed with real authority instead of hollow recommendations, and perhaps most importantly, a permanent federal task force would be dedicated to rooting out corruption networks before they could metastasize. "This is not about punishing bad cops," Rachel said firmly. "This is about protecting good ones, protecting communities, protecting trust. Marcus Lee's death will not be the last word. His name will stand for accountability." Months later, Rachel visited a modest home on the edge of Houston. The Lee family welcomed her quietly, grief still heavy in the air, but tempered now with a fragile sense of peace. Marcus's mother held Rachel's hands tightly, tears shining in her eyes. "For 2 years they told me I was crazy, that my son did this to himself. Thank you. Thank you for proving what I always knew." Rachel's voice softened. He deserved better. And now, because of him, the system will be better. They stood in the living room surrounded by photographs. Marcus as a boy with missing teeth. Marcus in a graduation gown. Marcus with his arms draped around friends, laughing. His smile seemed to light every frame. For the first time since the nightmare began, his mother smiled too. The story spread far beyond Texas. Families once silenced found their voices again. Dozens of wrongful convictions tied to Miller and Crowe were overturned. Men and women walked free after years stolen, their records wiped, their dignity restored. And across the country, people repeated the same lesson. Corruption thrives in silence, but silence had been shattered. Rachel Monroe carried that knowledge like a scar. She knew justice didn't come as a single thunderbolt. It came like the desert sunrise, slow, relentless, impossible to stop once it began. Finch sat in his 6x9 cell, replaying the miscalculation that had doomed him. Miller and Crowe aged behind bars, stripped of their badges, stripped of their power, and Marcus Lee's name lived on, not as a statistic, but as a shield protecting countless others. Rachel returned one last time to that lonely stretch of Highway 45. The sun was high, the air shimmering with heat, the road silent except for the occasional whine of a passing truck. She pulled onto the same gravel shoulder where it had begun. For a long moment, she just sat there, window down, the desert air washing over her. She thought of the cuffs biting into her wrists, the powder Crow had dangled, Miller's sneer, and she thought of how close corruption had come to winning. Then she whispered into the hot wind, "Game over." Sometimes the people who think they found the perfect victim end up writing their own downfall. If you believe stories like Marcus Lee's need to be told, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel, because justice only lives when we refuse to stay silent.